Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. Hopefully everybody can see my screen, and this screen is the first screen that you get to when you first log into the system. So for today's session, we're going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish, and it's going to be really open-ended. So if you have any questions along the way, feel free to just jump right in and unmute yourself, or if it's easier, you can just send it through the Zoom chat. So this is the screen that lists all of your clients. And if we're going to add a new client, you go up to that add button. And then the key things to enter in are first name. So we're going to call him Ben, and last name, Collins. You can put the middle name in as well if you have it. Now this email field, this is important if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. You'd basically put in their email, you'd click this use questionnaire box, and then when you added them to the system, it would send them off an email that would say, click here to access your questionnaire. So they'd click there, they'd have to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to do it all in one sitting. They can come back into it at any time. And then they go through their online questionnaire and they put in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they fill out will automatically populate back into your system. So they don't need to send it back to you or anything like that. It's just automatic. So that can be a really great way to save a lot of time so that you don't have to do all of the manual data entry. But you also can, so it kind of depends on your client's circumstances. Some clients are a little more tech savvy than others. Some may just prefer to use whatever system you have now. So if you have like a PDF or Word document that you send to them, you have your own questionnaire, you can use that, and then just don't click this use questionnaire box. Or maybe you even do it in the meeting live with them. You just sort of go through, share your screen, and collect their information that way. So it's up to you, but if you are going to send it, just make sure you put in their email and you click that box. If not, then don't worry about the email and don't click that use questionnaire box. Then we'll go ahead and add Ben. So now today, since we're doing a spouse client file, this means that we're doing wills for both spouses. So if you were just doing one will and the other spouse happened to be a beneficiary, you don't need to add them both as separate clients in the system. You could just add the spouse to the family tree in that one client's profile. But this is if you're doing wills for both spouses. So like a mirror will kind of situation. Then you're going to add them both as clients to the system and use the spouse client function to link them together so that a lot of information will be synced automatically, and you've also got the option to sync manually too. So we're going to go back to add. We're going to add our second spouse in, Lauren Collins. And the key thing is when you're adding the second spouse to the system, this is when you go to this spouse client little field right here, and then you click the name of the first spouse. So you can only do this when you're adding the second spouse because the first spouse needs to be in the system in order to choose them from that list. So this is just when you're doing the second spouse. Contributors down here at the bottom, this is just if you have multiple users on your account and they're not all admins, you can sort of pick and choose which users you want to have access to this client file by appointing primary and secondary contributors. And then the other function it has, whoever is this primary contributor, whoever's listed there, is going to be the name that appears on the cover page when you generate the document for that client. Then we'll go ahead and add. So that's sort of how you would go about adding a client and doing the spouse client linking. But does anyone have any questions so far? You can always feel free to just unmute yourself or send it through the chat if that's easier. Nope. Okay, we'll continue on, but don't be shy. So today we're going to start with Ben Collins. So you pick a spouse to start with, and then you just click on their name to go into their profile. And if they had filled out a codicil, so we don't do codicils in the system. Someone asked if we generate codicils, and that's not one of the options currently with our system. You'd have to do that separately yourself. But yeah, so this is what you would come to see. If the client had filled out that questionnaire, you had chosen to send it to them, then you would see whatever they put in. So if they hadn't even started the questionnaire yet, you would just be started with this. If they had filled out the questionnaire and built out their entire family tree, you would just see whatever they had put in. But today we didn't send them the questionnaire. We're just going to do that entry ourselves. So what I usually like to start with is editing the client's information. And there's two ways you can do it. You can click edit and it will edit whoever that blue circle is around, or you can just double click on the icon you want to edit. That's what I usually like doing better. And then the key things that you're going to need to fill out are first name, last name, and gender, because it has implications on the will. It's also known as field, maybe Ben's also known as Benny Collins. You can fill that out and it will come up in the will. Ben, also known as Benny, kind of thing. Date of birth, you can pick it from this calendar, but usually I like to just type it in. So month, day, year. So maybe like June 7th, 1967. And then that age automatically calculates for you. Country of birth, you can pick it from this list. You can pick multiple citizenships if you want. All of this other information, this is good information to have on your file. The Law Society recommends it, but it doesn't have an effect on the actual will itself. It's just good information to have on your client for your file. If you click on residency, this is important because however you set the province to here is how the system knows to calculate probate tax throughout. And if you're from Nova Scotia or BC, then it will generate documents in Nova Scotia or BC precedent, specifically single will. So you'd have to change this province here. The default is whatever your residency is as the user, but just make sure you keep an eye on that if you're from a different province. And then city is going to be important as well because it will populate in the will. So if we wanted to say Ben Collins from the city of Toronto, then make sure that city field is populated. Then for special circumstances, this is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues for the client. So you would just mark it off here. You could write a description. Again, it doesn't affect the will per se, but it's good information to have on your file, especially if you suspect there may be some sort of capacity or will challenge down the line. And then lastly, we have direct relationship. So it's just going to list who they're related to on the family tree and what the relation is. Then we'll go ahead and save. So next, let's say we wanted to add a child to the family tree. So whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So you click once on the person's icon to get that blue circle around them, and you double click to pull up their information. So I'm just going to click once on Ben to get that blue circle, and then go to the add button, child. Now here you've got three options. So it's going to ask you who the other parent of the child is, whether it's Lauren, who's the current spouse, whether it's a new parent who maybe is an ex-spouse who is going to be involved in the will, or they are a single parent. So they're either a single parent or they have an ex-spouse, but they're not going to be involved in the will. So you don't need to add them to the family tree. You can just put single parent. But today, let's say Lauren's the other parent. Then you're going to enter the information for the child. So again, first name, last name, and gender are the key fields to fill out. Date of birth, you can put in as well, June 10th, 2000. And then this special circumstances section. So for the client, it's a place where you can note potential capacity issues. But for anyone else on the family tree that's not the client, it's a place where you can note relationship difficulties to the client. So you have that kind of thing documented. But most importantly is this disability function. So if that individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure that that button is clicked off so that later on, if you're trying to do a Henson Trust or something like that, the system's going to pick up on the fact that this individual is disabled and you're trying to do a Henson Trust, and it will draft that wording accordingly. And we'll go and add. So you might notice that if you look at your list, there's no option to add a grandchild or a niece and nephew, but there is still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do it through direct relationships. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, you have to add a child to Ben, click on the child's icon, and add a child to that child. So we're going to say, let's say he's a single parent. And now we can enter the grandchild's information. So let's say Lily Collins, female, we'll add. Same kind of thing for niece and nephew. You would just add a sibling. So you'd click on Ben, you'd add a sibling to Ben, and then you'd click on the siblings icon and add a child to that sibling. Now, if there's going to be anybody else involved in the will in a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that doesn't fit on the family tree because they're not family or they're just really distant family, you can add them over here on the Other tab. So that way, you'll have everybody in the system, you'll have all their information, and later on, when we're doing the planning and we're choosing beneficiaries and appointing people, you'll be able to choose them from the drop-down list. So we're going to add them here. Let's say Jordy's going to be a trustee later on. So we're going to add him in this section. Jordy Ayton. Let's say he is a lawyer. And we'll go and add. So that's sort of the people section. Does anyone have any questions so far?
I had a quick question. You said when you were talking about parents that if the other spouse is the parent, then you just click on them as the other parent. But then for the other two categories, can you just clarify? Did you say that if it's a parent who is going to be involved in the will, then you'd click on new parent, and if it's a parent who is not going to be involved in the will in any way, then you just say single parent? Is that what you said?
Exactly. So if
Okay.
the ex-parent is going to be involved in the will and you're going to need their information in the system, I would add them as
Okay.
the other parent. But if
Okay.
not, I would just say single parent because sometimes you don't even have that information on the ex-spouse, right?
Right. Thank you.
No problem. Is there a way we can do a test will on our own accounts to see how the actual will is generated? Yes. So if you sort of you'd have to do some sort of planning because the will is generated based on contextual information that you put in the system. But even if you follow along like we are today and do it in your own account, then you'll be able to just generate the will and you'll be able to see the clauses and get a sense of what gets generated. So we don't have a clause bank where you'll be able to see every single potential clause that can get generated, but you'll be able to see, at least for a basic will, what kind of things get generated. It's just because it's all contextual. So if you generate just a simple will, you're not going to get those like complicated house trust clauses and that kind of stuff. But if you create a house trust in the system, then it's going to generate that house trust clause. So that's kind of how it works. But if you just want to get a sense of at the base level what the will kind of looks like, you can just go through, maybe do a really simple plan, run an e-plan even, which I'll show you later, and then generate the document and you'll get a sense of sort of what it looks like.
I have a question.
Yep.
So I've entered the he, the she, and I've also entered under the he, she, their respective siblings. But what I've noticed is, for example, the she brother appears on the tree line of the husband. And when I go into the edit mode, I verify that it is the relationship to the she, but somehow that bubble is on the husband's side, even though it's a sibling to the she, the wife. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so sometimes the way it's coded, the family tree doesn't always look 100% right. Like it might be on the wrong side, even though it's like the other person's sibling kind of thing. But you just need to make sure, as long as it says down here in this direct relationship system, as long as it's correct and it's saying the proper sibling is the sibling or the sibling-in-law kind of thing, then you're okay. So sometimes the visual might look a little bit different than how in your head she would belong on the other side. But as long as this information is correct here in this direct relationship system, then you can be confident the system's picking up on it correctly. It just might be a little bit jumbled on the actual viewing of it. One other question. When you generate the will, does it charge the account? So it depends on what, so if you're just signed up and you're on a 30-day trial, you're going to see that message that says you're going to get charged. But if you're on the 30-day trial, don't worry about it because you won't get charged anything. But if you're on the flex plan and you've started your account that way, then the fee gets charged whenever you generate your first document or summary for that client. So that's what the trigger is to incur the fee. And then after that, for that client, you can generate as many different versions, as many different documents and summaries as you want, and it's all covered under that one-time fee. But yeah, the trigger isn't adding them to the system or any of the planning. It's when you generate that first document or a summary. So that's the trigger. Okay. We'll keep going, but jump in if you have any other questions. The next section is assets. So there's a couple of different things you can do here. You're always going to start with the general personal effects, just to remind you to gift them to someone specifically in the will so that you're triggering a special general personal effects clause. You don't need to value it or anything like that. It's more of a reminder to gift it so that it triggers that clause. But if you wanted, you can always edit any of the details there. But for any other assets, it kind of depends. If you maybe have a really high net worth client, you want to lay out all of their assets, get all the information for all their assets, and sort of plan accordingly based on what they have, then you're going to want to add all of those assets into the system. But if you have if you're just doing a really simple kind of typical will and the client doesn't have very many assets, they're just really going to be dealing with residue to spouse, residue to kids kind of thing, then you don't need to add every single asset into the system. You can just deal with the residue breakdown later on. But the one thing that you do have to do here is any assets that are going to be specific asset bequests, you need to make sure they're added in as assets in this section so that later we have the option to specifically bequest them. Or if you're dealing with registered assets and you either want them confirmed or to do a new designation in the will, you also have to add them in on this section. So let's add a couple in. So we're going to go add, you select your asset sort of category and then your type within it. So let's start with a bank account. So this asset name field, this is really the most important because if you're gifting it specifically, it's however you put the asset name here is how it's going to be referred to in the will. So usually I change it so that it has actual identifying information because not only if you don't end up gifting it in the will, it's still going to be how it's referred to throughout the system. And if you're adding in 3 bank accounts and they're all called bank account, it can get kind of confusing. So I just changed the actual asset name to however I would identify it as. So maybe it's RBC bank account 123, whatever this account number is. So that way, if I'm adding multiple bank accounts, I know which one is which, and they're not just all called bank account. Everything else is for information on the asset, which is good to have. You don't have to put in values, but if you do, it will automatically calculate that probate tax for you, which is cool to sort of show the client. And then let's say the ownership, we're going to leave it as sole for this bank account. We'll add that in. Next, let's say we're going to add a house. So go real estate, home, select. So again, however you want that asset referred to, maybe it's the family home, maybe there's a bunch of homes, then you can change that asset name. The address field will also populate. So let's call it 123 Anywhere Street. City, country, province, all good to have that kind of information on the asset. The current value, let's put in, it's $1 million. It's in Toronto. It's got to be at least $1 million. This mortgage/encumbrances field, this is important because if there is a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of that mortgage in this field right here. So later on, when we get to the debt section, you'll notice that there's an opportunity to add the mortgage in there. But if it's associated with a specific asset that you're adding to the system, I would add it in this field instead, because not only is it good to know what debt that or what asset that debt is associated with, but also it has an effect on the probate tax that gets calculated. The one thing is just make sure you're not adding in a value here and then adding in that same mortgage in the debt section, because then it will double count it. So usually I just leave it out of the debt section and I put it in this mortgage field right here. Then let's say the ownership is joint. So we're going to put joint, and then just remember to scroll down so you can add in the other joint owner. So don't worry about this little person plus button. I would just ignore it, because as long as you've added everyone into the system on that people tab, you can just click right on where it says add owner, and it's going to bring up everybody you've added in. So we're going to pick Lauren, the spouse, and then add. And now this family home, since we marked it as joint with Lauren and we linked them together at the beginning, when I go into Lauren's profile, I don't have to then add in the house again in hers. I'm just going to be able to switch over and it's automatically there for me. So that's cool. Go back to Ben. We'll add one more. Let's say we're going to do an RSP. So again, I would change the name to however I want it referred to, so that I can sort of differentiate the asset in the system. This beneficiary field, this is just for information purposes, whoever the current beneficiary on the policy is. Later on, you're going to be able to do a new designation or confirm that designation, depending on what you want to do. But this is just information on the asset currently. Let's put a current value in. So you might notice that that probate tax is calculated automatically, but the income tax isn't. And that's just because due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets, it's going to be a manual calculation if you want it to show. So usually what we do, we try to estimate the highest possible tax it could incur, just to show clients an estimate of what they're looking at. So with an asset that would have a capital gain, you would do like 25% of that gain. Something like an RSP, probably put in 50% of that. So that way you're sort of showing them the high end of what they could possibly incur. So that's assets. Are there any questions here? Nope. Okay. Then we'll go to debts. So again, this is more just for information purposes. It doesn't really have too much of an effect on the will. But you would just go to add debt and just don't add the mortgage in again because we already added it. So let's say we have a credit card. We'll put in the credit card balance 5,000, just to give them a more accurate value of the net value of their estate at this point in time. Then we get to scenarios. So this is where all of the planning happens in the system. And basically the idea is that at the most, depending on your client's situation, you go through these 3 scenarios and create a plan in each one of them. So that way you've sort of covered your bases no matter what ultimately ends up happening to the client and their family. So you would start with surviving spouse and you would go through it like that. But if you're dealing with a typical situation, there's this new thing we call e-plans, which is this little lightning bolt up in the top corner. And what it does is it basically goes through the scenarios and appointments section and does the planning for you. So it can be good if that's the exact plan that you want. It's just a faster way, it does it for you. But it's also good even if you want parts of it but want to change parts of it. It gives you a really good foundation and a starting point so that you're not starting from scratch. So you just click on this lightning bolt and you can sort of look through the e-plans. So there's some separated spouse with adult children because we've got a couple of family law users on there that are often dealing with those situations. And then we've got these 3 at the top that are the really typical ones. So if you're dealing with a spouse with adult children, spouse with younger children, and you want a 1-stage trust or a 2 distribution trust. So let's say I have a spouse with younger children, so I'm going to do this 2 distributions trust. And I'm looking at the details. So it's telling me in the surviving spouse, it's going to give everything absolutely to the spouse 100%. They're going to be the trustee and the sole beneficiary. In the second scenario, it's going to give everything to the children in trust, give them 50% at 25 and the rest at 30. Let's say I like the idea of a 2-stage trust, but I'm going to want to change those details. That's okay. I can still run this, and then I'll go in and change the information after. And then the no descendants, it has half to each set of siblings. So maybe you don't even want to plan for this scenario at all. We can still run this, and then we'll just go in and change that information after. It's just giving us a starting point so we don't have to start from scratch. So I'm going to click it, and I'm going to execute. And now when I go into this, it's filled out. So it's not just starting from scratch empty. So the first section, joint designated assets, it's going to show us anything that's marked as joint or any registered assets are going to automatically go to the spouse in this section, in this scenario. And if we go to our little summary tab over here, we can sort of see the implications of how much income tax and probate tax we're saving based on the plan. So that can be cool to show the clients as well. Then initial gifts. So you have those general personal effects and they go to the spouse because we ran that e-plan, which is exactly what we want to do because it will generate that special personal effects clause. And then lastly, the balance. So it's got everything going 100% to Lauren, and there's no gift over because we'll deal with the gift over in the second scenario. That's essentially the gift over. So we don't need to put a gift over in here. And just so everyone knows, any assets that are left here, these green boxes, just automatically fall into the balance of the estate. So you don't need to put them anywhere. It just knows anything left will go into the residue. So this one looks good. Then I'll go to my second scenario, descendants only. Probably not any joint or designated assets. So we'll go right to initial gifts. It's got the general personal effects going to the children. So let me just show you quickly how you do that manually if you didn't run the e-plan. So it would appear in your list of assets over here. You would just drag and drop it over. Then you would click on the beneficiaries line and it's going to list everybody that you've added. So you can name the children specifically, or you can scroll down and you can use classes. So you can use the class of children instead. And then we'll add. And then lastly, this is our trust. So it's going to tell us that there's a trust for the children, and I'm going to see the details of this because I know I wanted to make a few changes. So right now, it has the duration to when they reach age 30, but I want it to be, I'm going to say 25 instead. I think 30 is too old for this kid. And then now I have a mandatory payment, a staged lump sum. I'm going to change this as well. So I'm going to say at age 21, they get 25%. And I can add more stages if I wanted to, or I could keep it at that. And then it's got the gift over to beneficiaries issue. If they don't have issue, then to the other class members, the other children. So this looks good. So I'll say save. And now it's saved that trust with the changes that I've made. And now let's say Lauren is going to also want the same thing. So that same trust for the children with the changes. To copy over everything I've done in this descendants only scenario over to her profile, I just click on this button over here, the spouse sync button, and it just copies information from this scenario over to hers. So I can click sync, and now I know it's going to be the same in hers as well. Then lastly, we'll go to no descendants. So here we're probably just going to deal with the balance of the estate. So that e-plan gives half to siblings, half to spouses' siblings. But let's say I didn't want to do that. Maybe I didn't want to plan in this scenario at all. I could just clear it and leave it like that, keep going. But maybe I did have an ultimate disaster that was different. So let's just say that maybe I wanted half to go to Jordy and half to go to a charity. So I'm going to make 2 segments, and then I'm going to add gifts within those segments to make sure I'm sort of specifying what's happening. So we'll start with segment 1 for 50%, since I'm going to be doing 2. And then I add a gift. I'm going to pick Jordy as the beneficiary. This percentage, this just means 100% of the 50%. So I'm not dividing that 50% down even further. So this is right. I want all of the 50% to go to Jordy. Maybe we'll put in a gift over to his issue, and then I'll add. So now we've dealt with 100% of this 50%. That's what the circles are showing us. So we don't want to add any more gifts to this segment because we've already dealt with 100% of it. What we do want to do is go back to this little grayed out segments button to get back to that main segments page. And then we'll add a second segment, segment 2 for 50%. And now we have to specify what's happening with this 50%. If you've already added the charity to the system, you can scroll all the way to the bottom and pick it from your list. If you're adding it for the first time, go to the 3 dots and then go New Charity. We're going to say Epilepsy Toronto because it's Purple Day, Epilepsy Awareness Day. We're going to do this number on Friday. But this ID field, it doesn't populate, so don't worry about it. If you have the CRA number, just put it directly in the line like I did. But if you don't, just don't worry about it. We're changing some things up to this soon, so this will disappear. Then we'll go add, and then I add. And now I've dealt with 100% of this 50%, and therefore 100% of everything. And then I'm going to sync it over to Lauren if she's going to want the same situation in that scenario as well. So that's sort of how I'd go through scenarios. I know that can be a lot to take in, but does anyone have any questions about the scenario section? Nope. Okay. Then we'll keep going. So next is appointments. So this is where you're going to put in your estate trustees and your guardians as well. So you start, because we ran that e-plan, it's going to make Lauren, the spouse, the primary estate trustee. But to do anything else, we're going to go add. If we wanted to make another, let's say Jordy, if you want to make another primary, we would set the condition as none. So none is going to make them a primary. If we put any sort of condition on it, then it will make them an alternate. And usually what I use is if all specified cannot act. And so it's going to be Lauren. If Lauren can't act, then Jordy. And the special spouse sync button is actually in the bottom left for appointments and POAs. So you just press sync and it's going to change Lauren and Ben's name. So Lauren's not her own estate trustee. And guardians is just over here if you needed to put those in. Then provisions. So the first thing, funeral arrangements. If you want those in the will, you can just type them right on that line. If not, just get rid of the text and there won't be a body disposition clause that comes up in the will. Include future members. This is if you're doing class gifts in the will and you want future members of that class to be included in the definition. So for example, if I did that class gift to children, maybe this is a young couple, they're likely to have more children. When it defines children in the will, it'll say John Collins and any other child born to me and Lauren, if I select future children. Class restrictions, you can, same kind of idea, you can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause. So it's not going to affect any trusts you've set up in the will, but it will affect beneficiaries that are underage that haven't had specific trusts set up for them. So like a grandchild through a gift over, it'll follow this general clause. And then there's secondary will assets. And this is if you're doing multiple wills, so primary, secondary, corporate, then you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. So these are just for definitions. If If you're doing a single will like we're doing today, you don't have to click or unclick any boxes. It just won't have any effect. So you can just leave it. The last two things are financial and personal care powers of attorney down here. And they just work the same way as the appointment section, where you just set none as the condition if you want them to be a primary, or you pick a condition if all specified cannot act if you want them to be an alternate. Then up here, this little exclamation button, this is what we call advisor insights. And it's basically like contextual planning information. It's like a checklist you can go through that will advise you depending on what you put in the system. So if you've added a disabled beneficiary or underage children or a foreign trustee or something like that, it's going to advise us accordingly of things that just to make sure we've taken those kind of things into consideration so we haven't forgotten any important planning things. Some of them will go away, like if you've forgotten to put in a gender and you go back and put in a gender, it'll disappear from the list, but not all of them do go away, and it doesn't affect the actual document generation. Beside that is just notes. So if you ever wanted to make notes on the client, like maybe you wanted to check spellings of names or note that you had done a title search on a property, you could make that here, and then these notes will appear at the end of the text scenario summary. And then the last button is this download button, and this is where you're going to generate your documents and your summaries. So let's start with summaries. So there's 3 of them. The first one's the profile summary, and it's going to give you all the information that either the clients filled out in their questionnaire or that you filled out for them like we did today. So it's going to have all the information on the people, so the client's profile, all the people on the family tree, all of the assets and those details, and then the debts as well. So this is really great to not only have on your file because it's all the information, but maybe even after the planning meeting, you can give it to the client and they can review everything to check for spelling of names and asset details and make sure everything's correct. The second thing is the scenario, the graphic scenario summary. So it's a really nice visual and it's really valuable if you're putting in values on assets because it sort of shows you the net value of the estate, what's going where, and how the funnel works. So this is a great visual to show sort of the overall estate plan for each of the different scenarios to the client. And then the last one is the text scenario summary. So it's going to give you all the information on all of the gifts and the residue breakdowns and everything you've done in the will. It's essentially the will without the legalese. It's just got the details, can be a more digestible format for the client so that they can truly understand sort of what's happening. So those are the summaries. And then you can go to documents. So if you are on trial, you can just ignore this message. If you're on the flex plan, then it's telling you that this is the first time I'm generating a document for this client. So then it's going to incur that fee. But these are all the documents you can generate: life insurance declarations, multiple wills, the POAs, a reporting letter, and the single will, which is what we're doing today. You can change the signing date. You can just pick another date. You can take it out and manually put it in the will later. It's up to you. The registered asset designation, this is if you want the registered asset, those designations either confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. You can check that box off. The joint designated asset confirmation, this is if you're dealing with a client who's got a lot of joint assets with adult children, and you want to confirm that everything that's joint is truly joint. It's not held in the resulting trust. Counterpart execution, this is if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified provisions, it'll give you a shorter will with less definitions and less powers. So if you're not doing any trusts, it's really simple. This may be more what your client's looking for. A will guide is a nice little chart at the end of the will that guides the clients to the clauses in that will. And then a cover page is a cover page. And you can pick your witnesses, anyone else who's a user on the account. If not, you can just click this blank box and you can manually put their information in the actual document. And you can include your affidavits as well if you want. And then you click generate. And it's going to give you a Word document of everything that you put in the system. And it's going to be fully editable, so you can always make any changes that you want to it. If you don't like certain clause, if you want to take something out, you can always edit anything you want. So here it is. This is the will of Ben, also known as Benny Collins of Toronto. Funds and plans. This is because we check that registered asset box. Assets passing outside of the will. This is because we check that joint asset box. Here's our definitions. My children means John Collins and any other child born to, adopted to, because we checked future children. Here are our executors. So Lauren, if Lauren can't act, then Jordy. Here's our funeral arrangement, disposition of body clause. Personal effects. So you're going to see this little red highlight, and that's just to draw your attention to it, because right now there's a couple of decisions you have to make in the system. So instead of doing the customization in the portal, which is going to come soon, right now you have to make this decision in the document. So you either decide the division of personal effects if it's up to the trustee's discretion, or if you want to implement some sort of lottery system or something like that. So you can keep A, B, and C, or you can take out A, B, and C and leave it to the trustee's discretion. Residue. So we've got it going to Lauren. If not to Lauren, this trust for the children. And then ultimately half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And then at the very bottom, you've got this nice little will guide that sort of guides the clients to the clauses in the will. And that's how you'd go about it. Then you'd go back to the system, you would go through Lauren's will, you'd check everything, and then you generate her document as well. And one other thing I do want to point out is this little question mark up in the top corner. So if you click it, it's going to bring you over to our help desk. And here you can search for anything on how to do certain things in the system, like how do I do a Henson Trust? It's going to give you a step-by-step guide on how to do it. Usually has some pictures involved, and it can be a really helpful resource if you're ever stuck on something. So you can check out our help desk, and if there's no article there, or if it's more specific to your file, you can of course always email support or email me directly as well if you need any help with anything. But that's sort of all I had for today. But does anyone have any specific questions about anything before we wrap up? Nope. Okay. Well, feel free if you do have any questions that you come to later on, don't hesitate to email me. I'm always here to help. So thanks everyone for joining me today, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.